Yeah, sir. I hope you can see the slides right now.
Yes, yes, okay. Should I start?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, I apologize for this glitch. We should have set this out before we started. So the $5 trillion question, I know what you're all thinking. Now, this $5 trillion question, what's in it for me? What difference does it make? What is this guy going to say? So let me tell you about the $5 trillion question. When the Indian economy, GDP, hits 5 trillion, what difference it makes to you? Imagine your monthly income today is 50,000 rupees. Let's say it doubles to 1 lakh rupees per month and nothing else changes. Your quality of life will improve. You live better, work better. Your environment will be better. So that's the difference it's going to make. Okay? So what I'm going to do is to tell you about the challenge of the 5 trillion question. Next slide, please. Okay. In 2019, Prime Minister Modi set the target of the 5 trillion GDP by 24-25. So when he said that in 2019, our GDP was $2.9 trillion. And we were to reach $5 trillion according to his aspiration by 2024-25 in a 5-year span. So to go from 2.9 trillion to 5 trillion in a matter of 5 years, people did the calculation and said that the economy has to grow roughly on the average at about 14% in nominal terms, at 9% in real terms. That's not possible. That's difficult because India has never ever grown at 9% consistently for 5 years. So it looked a difficult target to achieve even when Prime Minister Modi set the target in 2019. It looks certainly impossible today after the devastation of the pandemic. So the question is, will we get to $5 trillion? Of course we will get there sometime in the future. But how quickly is the question? Economists today say that if we grow at about 14% in nominal terms, about 8 to 9% consistently, we might get to 5 trillion by 28, 29, or perhaps even later. And remember, before I set off, I want you to remember that we're talking about GDP in nominal terms, in exchange, in dollar terms. So both the inflation rate and the exchange rate matter. Next slide, please. So before we get started, the big picture first. From a global perspective, where does India stand? It's the 5th largest economy in the world with a GDP of 2 billion. I'm using 2019 figures because that was the pre-pandemic, and I'll give you an idea of a comparative picture across the world before the pandemic hit us. Next slide, please. So this is GDP over the last 5 years. GDP in 2019, 5 countries: USA, first largest economy, followed by China, Japan, and Germany. India, with $2.9 trillion in 2019, is the 5th largest economy. But you see that India is a minion compared to the US, for example. Our GDP is about 12 to 13% of their GDP, although we're the 5th largest. I also want you to know that the 5th position in the global ranking interchanges between India, UK, and France. So we are in the 5th, 6th, and 7th positions each year. Next slide, please. So we are a large economy, but we're also a poor country. Poverty among countries, there are many measures to measure poverty. There is poverty ratio, there is Gini coefficient, there is per capita income. All these measures are problematic because they make inter-country comparison difficult. The least problematic, of course, is the per capita income. And if we look at the per capita income ranking of countries, this is where India stands. Next slide, please. India stands at number 141, at the bottom of the League of Nations. The America stands at 8th, Germany 16th, Japan 24th, China 67, India at 141 per capita GDP. So imagine that you understand how poor we are. Next slide. Yeah. So India is a large country, large economy, but a poor country. We're the poorest in the G20. We're poorest among the BRICS countries. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's a grouping of middle-income countries. We are the poorest among them. And also, as a country, we have more poor people than the entire continent of Africa. So we're a large economy, but a poor country. Next slide, please. The question is it possible for a large economy to grow rapidly? If you look at growth of countries in the 20th century, after the Second World War, after 1950, you will see that certain countries have clocked rapid growth rates. For example, the tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, they've clocked rapid growth and transited from low income to middle income to high income in a matter of one generation. When that example is posed to India, our standard response is to say that it's possible for small economies to grow fast, but it's not possible for a large economy like India to really clock a very rapid growth rate. Until, next slide, please. China came on the scene. Until China came, even a large continental size economy can indeed grow very rapidly. China clocked growth of 10% on the trot for 30 years on a trot, remarkable by global standards. In fact, in 1990, India and China were at around the same level. After that, China zoomed, while India just lumbered along. Today, China, 1990, we were at par. 30 years later, today, China is 5 times India's GDP. China's per capita GDP is nearly 5 times India's. China is the largest manufacturing country in the world. China is the largest trading country in the world. India's share in global manufacturing, India's share in global trade are in single digits. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, unprecedented in human history. India still has hundreds of millions of people in poverty. China is a middle-income country, a high middle-income country, trying to prevent or avoid a middle-income trap. India is a low middle-income country, trying to get out of a low-income trap. So China demonstrated that even a large continental-sized economy can grow, inspiring therefore India that it is indeed possible. Next slide, please. China showed that it's possible for a large economy to grow rapidly, but I want to emphasize that rapid growth is good, but it is not enough. We got to make sure that the benefits of growth go to all sections of people, particularly the low-income segments. Otherwise, there will be inequality. Inequality is bad for many reasons. It is morally wrong. It is politically corrosive. But it is also bad economics. Why? India's growth and our ability to maintain a high growth will depend on our ability to ensure that the bottom sections of population enjoy the benefits of growth. The reason is this: if the benefits of growth do not go to the bottom segments of the population, they will not consume, but it is their demand. When their income goes up, it is their consumption demand which is the biggest growth driver for Indian economy. So if we want to grow rapidly, we need to ensure that the benefits of growth go to the poorest sections of our population. Thank you. Next question. Next slide, please. So the task for India is to accelerate the growth rate and make sure that the benefits of growth are widely shared, which as I explained. So what I'm going to do, will you show the next slide? Over the next 25 minutes or so, is to talk about 8 key challenges that India has to meet or manage in order to clock or meet a $5 trillion GDP. Next slide, please. The first challenge is investment. If you ask me, give me a one-word answer for India to grow rapidly, I would say the one-word answer is investment. Why is investment important? Because investment today is tomorrow's production capacity. And our own history, economic history, shows that whenever India had high investment rate, our growth rate was high. In the pre-crisis years from 2003 to 2008, when we clocked growth rate of 8% per year annum consistently for 5 years and beyond, in fact, the reason was that investment was high. Since then, investment has come down. So investment is important for us to be able to grow rapidly. And what needs to be done to ensure that we get investment in agriculture, investment in manufacturing, investment in services? What needs to be done is implement structural reforms, implement governance reforms. Many years ago, I was finance secretary in Andhra Pradesh, and one of my responsibilities was to ensure that investment comes to our state. So we used to go around the country, go around the world, canvassing our state to potential entrepreneurs. And we used to promise them lots of freebies, like we'll give you free land, free concessional tax, free power, free water. Potential entrepreneurs, potential investors like all that. But if you ask them, what is it you really want in order to invest in our state? What they really want is law and order, rule of law. What they want and what they asked us was, please ensure that our inspectors don't come to our factory. Please ensure that we are able to comply with your regulations. Your regulations are clear and that we're able to comply with them without your inspectors coming to us. So what investors want is structural reforms. What investors want is good governance. That's the first challenge. The second challenge, please, next slide, please. The second challenge is that we not only need investment, I said the key to growth is one-word answers investment, but one-word answers are insufficient. So if you ask me to elaborate on that, I would say that what we need to do is to improve the productivity of investment. Today, as I said earlier, China has stolen a march on us. Why is China able to do that? China is the largest manufacturer, the largest exporter in the world, because China's productivity is high compared to ours. China is, for example, for the Ganesh Chaturthi, China is able to make Ganesh idols in China and export them to markets in Delhi and Mumbai and sell to Indians. That's how much more of their productivity. We're not able to manufacture in the neighborhood and sell in Delhi and Mumbai, and China is competing with us in our own backyard. So China's productivity is high, and we need to improve our productivity. For improving our productivity, we need to improve our infrastructure. We all live in India, we understand, we know how poor our infrastructure is. But to understand really how poor our infrastructure is, you need to go to a developed country and spend at least half an hour there. Then you will realize how poor India's infrastructure is. We need to build better roads, ports, airports, warehouses, telecom. We need to improve skills. There is a skill shortage. Actually, skill shortage is a crisis. We want to manufacture 200 million tons of steel. We can't find a trained lathe operator. We generate 400,000 engineers every year. Not more than 100,000 engineers are employable. The remaining 300,000 engineers need to be further trained. There's 7,000 ITIs in the country, ITIs. They're not functioning. They turn out poorly trained technicians. So we need to improve the skill endowment of the country. Transaction costs. We need to reduce the transaction costs. I talked about governance reforms. Governance reforms, the purpose is to reduce transaction costs. Again, as I told you, when I was in the business of inviting investment into our country, into our state, the entrepreneurs come and they come and tell us, we invite them and ask them to test out or consider our state, our country as a possible investment site. Typically, they say, oh, we're coming from China. We're considering China and India. So what will you give us? So we'll tell them what we give. Well, we'll give them land, power, tax concessions, etc., etc. They say, okay, the Chinese promised that they will give all of this in 6 months. How long will you take? We tell them, oh, okay, the Chinese told you 6 months, we'll give it to you in 3 months. Chinese, having promised to deliver in 6 months, actually deliver in 3 months. We, having promised that we will deliver in 3 months, will not deliver even in 3 years. So that is the difference in transaction cost between China and India. And that's the second challenge, improving the productivity of investment. Move on, please, the third, next slide. The third challenge is improving education and health outcomes. And this is quite evident. If you compare countries which have developed over the last 75 years, so after the Second World War, I mentioned the Asian tigers, then other Asian countries in Latin America, countries which have increased their GDP, grown, are countries which have improved their health and education outcomes. There's a very clear correlation. If you talk to economists, they say that what we need to do is to spend more on education and health. That is true. We need to spend more on education and health. In fact, the World Bank norm for countries spending on education and health is 6% of GDP on education, 4% on health. We don't spend that much. And that became very clear during the pandemic, our limited expenditure on education and health. We need to spend more on education. The challenge in education is enrollment, retention, and achievement. Over the last 75 years since independence, we have largely met the challenge of enrollment. Our midday meal scheme is one of the best in the country, one of the largest in the country. We should be proud of that. The midday meal scheme has actually improved enrollment. Enrollment in school is now nearly 100%, including enrollment of girls. The next challenge is retention. In order to be able to retain children, we need to make going to school a happy experience for them. Some years ago, we realized that the challenge for girls was absence of toilets. So there's been a large program of building toilets for girls. But the remaining challenge today is improving the achievement level, standards of education. We know from surveys that come out periodically, virtually every year, that our class 5 children, they cannot write a complete sentence. They cannot multiply two double-digit numbers. So achievement levels of our children are very poor. Similarly, the challenge on the health side. We should be proud of some of the things that we've done. The ICDS, the Child Nutrition Program, is possibly one of the best in the world because nutritional deficiencies contracted in infancy can never be repaired. So India has done big things on child nutrition. But we need to spend more on public health, on preventive health care across villages of the country. And it's not just spending on health, it's spending on hygiene, sanitation. So improving health and education outcomes is the third biggest challenge. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, the fourth challenge is creating jobs. You all understand that you're all students studying. Very soon you'll go into the labor market. You're looking for jobs so as to build your careers. Unemployment problem is a big, big problem in the country. It's reaching explosive proportions. There are 12 million people who enter the labor market every month. We're not able to employ even 6 million people, create 6 million job opportunities every month. So you understand not only is the employment problem getting bigger, it is getting explosive. And if the employment problem gets big, it's not only an economic problem, it can turn into a social problem. We all read about what the pandemic has done. Millions of people, tens of millions of people have lost their jobs in the informal sector and they've still not regained them. I put a bullet there, demographic dividend. I want you to understand this. You people may not appreciate this, but until 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, we were talking about our large population being a problem. Because even as we're doing a lot of things to grow the economy, because population is increasing rapidly, the quality of life of people is not improving. So we used to treat our huge population as a burden, as a problem. But that narrative has changed over the last 15 years. There is now talk about our huge population being a positive. Why? People say it's a positive because if you do international comparison, many countries around the world, population is declining, like in Japan, in Scandinavian countries. In several other countries, population growth is plateauing, in Europe, in America, but even in China. But in India, population is still growing. We have a young population, median age is 29. So from an international perspective, our young growing population is a positive because all these people will join the labor market, they will add to production, they will earn, they will spend, they will consume, they will save. That'll generate demand for investment, demand for consumption. That'll generate more jobs, more growth, so we can get onto a virtuous cycle. That's the theory. What's the problem with this? Let me tell you what the problem is. I don't know how many of you read Sherlock Holmes these days. Sherlock Holmes? Sherlock Holmes and Watson, his assistant, they go to investigate a crime. While investigating that crime, they go outside London and it gets dark. They can't get back to London City. So they pitch a tent and go to sleep. In the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes gets up and he shakes Watson awake and says, "Watson, get up, get up." So Watson opens his eyes. Then he says, "What's happened? Dr. Holmes, why you woken me up?" So Watson, can you look up? What do you see? Watson says, "Oh, I see the perfect sky, stars. In London there is fog. We can never see. Thank you for waking me up. Such a wonderful sight." So Watson, what else do you see? "I see the stars. I see the moon. I see the sublime creation of God." And Sherlock Holmes gets flustered, irritated. "Watson, don't you see somebody stole our tent?" So that's the point. The big point is we cannot get demographic dividend until we generate jobs for these people. So creating jobs is a big, big challenge. Where are jobs going to come from? Jobs are not going to come from the agriculture sector. In fact, if agriculture productivity improves, agriculture is going to throw away hundreds of millions of people who've got to be found jobs in manufacturing and service sectors. Jobs are not going to come from the service sector, not in the immediate future anyway. The software sector is big, of course, but it employs just 4 lakh people. 4 lakh people in a country where the labor force is maybe 400 to 500 million. Jobs have to come from manufacturing because manufacturing, especially manufacturing in the small and medium sector, is employment intensive. There are some people who say that China has grown as a manufacturing country, but India cannot replicate that model of China growth because China grew as a manufacturing country 30 years ago when there was no backlash against globalization. Global demand was on the rise. And China perfected this new model of global value chains. Now there's a backlash against globalization. Global demand is actually declining because the population is going down. And the global value chain model of manufacturing itself is losing currency. Even in spite of that, I believe that our future, indeed, our challenge of creating jobs cannot be met unless we become a manufacturing country. That's why the Prime Minister spoke about Make in India. Next, please. The fifth challenge is raising agricultural productivity. I won't talk much about it for two reasons. Because I don't know much about it. I put it down because it is important. Also because you all know, over the last 2 years, we had this farmers' agitation against the farm laws. So all the issues in our agriculture sector are well known. They've been debated extensively in the media, in the public domain. The problem is that our agriculture productivity is very low. There are several other problems. Incentives are flawed. There is no credit. We encourage people to grow water-intensive crops which actually degrade soil, like wheat and rice, whereas we should be growing crops where we have a comparative advantage. So all these things are to be challenged. There is no simple or single solution, but raising agricultural productivity is very, very key to our reaching $5 trillion. People often say, well, how does agriculture matter? It's only 15% of GDP. That is true. Agriculture contributes only 15% of GDP. In fact, if our economy grows, the share of agriculture will in fact come down even further. But agriculture is important because nearly 50% of our labor force is employed in agriculture. So the economic well-being of our country, the emotional well-being of our people depends on agriculture. Next slide, please. The sixth challenge is maintaining macroeconomic stability. This is quite self-evident. What is macroeconomic stability? Macroeconomic stability is price stability, that is low and steady inflation. Financial stability, which is that our financial markets must be functioning, our financial institutions must be functioning, they must be giving credit, people must be demanding credit, and institutions must be giving credit. And exchange rate stability. Price stability, financial stability, and exchange rate stability. Why is it important? It is important because if you need to get investment, if you need to get consumption, you need to give people a predictable economic environment. Just imagine, if you want to start a factory, if you want to invest 10 crore rupees, you want to know, you've got to make projections for the next 5 years, next 10 years. How much do you borrow? Can you repay? How much will you generate? So in order to make those calculations, you need to have a stable economic environment. If your prices are going up, if there's no financial stability, you cannot really achieve $5 trillion. The problem in maintaining financial stability is that short-term compulsions militate against long-term sustainability. Let me give you one example. Over the last 2 years, as we battle the pandemic, one challenge for the government has been to spend money on providing support to people who have been hit by the pandemic. But the government did not have enough tax resources. They had to borrow. The question was, how much can they borrow? Because if you borrow, you have to repay. If you borrow, can we repay? Or are we passing on the repayment burden to the next generation? If my generation of people borrow and enjoy that money, and if the burden of repayment falls on you people who are going to join the labor market and work in the labor market for the next 30 to 35 years, is that fair? Is it fair that my generation of people benefit at the expense of the next generation? Short-term compulsions militate against long-term sustainability. The next slide, please. The next challenge is managing global mega trends. This is an entire lecture, indeed an entire textbook by itself. But I want to address this in just 2 minutes. If you ask anybody today, what are the global trends that India has to face over the next 5-10 years, the listing will certainly include these 4. Diverse demographic transition, which I've already talked about, which is that some countries in the world, like in Japan, like in Scandinavian countries, populations are declining. Some countries, populations are plateauing. Some countries, populations are growing, but slowly. Some countries, populations are growing, but rapidly. So this diverse demographic transitions different countries are going through changes or makes the demand-supply pattern very complex. And we've got to be able to understand that and to be able to respond to that in order to become a 5 trillion economy. For example, let me give you a very simple example. If people are aging, if the older age group share in the total population is increasing, as is happening in Japan today, the demand pattern shifts. People no longer buy goods, they buy services. They no longer buy TVs or washing machines. Or they go to restaurants, they go on vacation, they go to old age homes. They want medical care, they want personal care. So people's demand shifts from goods to services. We need to be able to respond to that. The second mega trend is globalization. If you read any publication today, if you talk to international experts, they will say that the pandemic is certainly going to reverse globalization. They say that the war in Ukraine is going to reverse globalization, that globalization's best days are behind us. Now there's going to be disglobalization or indeed deglobalization. I, for one, don't believe that. I think globalization is going to be there, globalization in a broad sense, not just of trade, but globalization of trade, finance, people, ideas. That's going to be there and that's going to increase. And India will need to meet the challenge of globalization because we are seeing that today. We want globalization because we want to be able to export. We need to be able to import. We need to be able to import oil. We need to be able to import goods that we don't have. We want to export what we can export. We want to improve our export capability. So we want globalization. We need to be able to respond to the changing patterns of globalization. Rise of technology. That's a big problem, especially in creating jobs, because the fear today is that technology is going to come in a big way and displace people, and jobs are going to go down. That machines will come and replace people, so there will be no jobs for us, especially for the future generation. This is not a new fear. Over centuries, since the Industrial Revolution, this has been a constant fear that machines will replace people. Each time, the actual outcome has been that machines did not replace people. Actually, as much as they replaced people in some jobs, they created more jobs than they destroyed. But many people say today that this is different. This Digital technology is different. Artificial intelligence is different. Jobs which are going to be destroyed are not going to be recreated. So there'll be less jobs in the future. We need to compete in a world where that might be a reality. Finally, climate change, that's very clear. Your generation of people, as you enter the job market, wherever you work, whichever sector you work, government, NGO, corporate, academia, if you go overseas, work anywhere, financial sector, climate change is going to be a big challenge, part of the national challenge, part of our collective challenge, part of your individual challenge. Next slide, please. The final challenge, the last on my list, is improving governance. You might ask, this guy has spoken about improving governance, why has he put this up as a separate challenge? I put this up because I want you to understand this. Why are some countries rich and some countries poor? This is a question that economists have struggled with for generations, and there is no definitive answer. The answers have changed from time to time. Initially, people said it's geography, that cold countries are better because people work better. In hot countries, tropical countries like India and much of Asia, weather is bad, people get tired, they cannot work hard, they're lethargic, there's disease, the soil is not very fertile. So geography makes the difference between rich and poor countries. Then people said culture. Culture is the answer. It is that some countries, notably Western countries, have a Protestant ethic, a work culture. They're innovative, they ask questions, whereas some economies, poor countries, they are discouraged from asking questions. They have no innovative culture. They have no work ethic. That was one explanation. The next explanation, we moved on from that to resources. Some people say that rich countries are rich because they have resources, and poor countries are poor because they don't have resources. Japan has disproved that. Japan does not have natural resources, but Japan is a rich country today and has moved from being a low-income country to a middle-income country and to a rich-income country in one generation or two generations. So Japan disproved that resources theory. People then say that it's because we didn't follow the right policies, ignorance of the right policies. Today, the received wisdom is that some countries are rich, some countries are poor because of a combination of all these reasons: geography, culture, resources, right policies. So can India get to Denmark? You're asking why is that a typo? It's not a typo. I put it there deliberately. You've heard of Francis Fukuyama. He's one of great historians, philosophers, thinkers today. He wrote a famous book called The End of History. He talks about Denmark as an ideal country because Denmark has the characteristics of a developed society. Those characteristics he talks about are a rule of law, a strong state, and democratic accountability. I will not go on to explain all of these because it will get very boring for you. I would urge you to read about that book, read that book if that's possible, read about that book. But India, does India tick those boxes? Is this rule of law in our country? Is India a strong state? Is there democratic accountability? There are no binary answers. Some people say yes, some people say no. But nobody says that we're at the top. Nobody says that India is an example for the world, like Denmark is. So we have to get to Denmark by improving a rule of law, a strong state. A strong state does not mean an authoritarian state. A strong state does not mean a totalitarian state. A strong state means a state where governance is strong, where there is fear of law, where there is rule of law, in the sense that if you violate law, you're punished. And if you comply with law, you're rewarded. And accountability. All these three things must be there, and then we will become a $5 trillion economy. Next slide, please. So here is a summary of the 8 challenges that I talked about for India to become a $5 trillion economy. Of course, if you get another speaker, he will have a different list of challenges. Probably some of them will be common, some of them will be different. But I do hope that I've given you enough to reflect on what it will take for India to go from about $3 trillion today to $5 trillion soon enough. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, sir. Should I stop presenting the slides?
Yes, please. That's all.
Okay, so audience, the chat box is open for the questions. Sir, I'll pick up questions and I'll ask you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start asking. One of the students have asked that besides replicating the China model, how can we create our own model and create jobs as industry automation might eat jobs of a lot of people in the manufacturing industry?
I wish I had a definitive answer. It's a good question. We should try to replicate the best parts of the China model. Manufacturing for a domestic market as well as for export market. I'm aware, and indeed I mentioned in my talk, that manufacturing and exporting manufacturers is going to be a big challenge, bigger challenge than China confronted. But I believe that there is no scope for manufacturing pessimism, simply because our share in global exports is very small. So even if the global export market shrinks a little bit, or even shrinks significantly, it is still possible for India to increase its share and gain from exporting. So I want to say the first thing we need to do is to pick up the best parts of the China model of growth and replicate them. Join the global value chains where we have a comparative advantage by making sure that investing in India is a profitable opportunity, both for domestic and foreign investors. Let me put a little more substance and meat into that question, because your question is, what else beyond the China model? I believe we should be focusing on small and medium industry. China, I don't know to what extent they did that, but we need to focus on small and medium industry because we need to create jobs. So as much as we need large manufacturing bases, we also need small and medium industries to be the forward and backward linkages for that. We need to focus on services because we all understand, and you more than me, that services are going to be the future. So as much as we focus on manufacturing, we need to focus on services, especially on how to export services. Digital technologies are making it possible to export services. 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we thought that services have to be homegrown. You cannot export services because how can you provide healthcare? How can you export healthcare? How can you export education? How can you export legal services? Today, not only these, but even much more personal services are exportable. So we need to hone our comparative advantage. So those are the three things I would say we should do beyond the China model.
Okay, sir. Another student called Shreyas asks, what do you think about the participation of the youth in the stock market, and how will that affect the economy of the country? And there's increased participation from the youth in that sector.
You know, one of the pet projects of the Reserve Bank of India is financial inclusion. Financial inclusion, as seen by public institutions, the government, Reserve Bank of India, and others, is to make sure that every household in the country has access to a bank account, benefits from having access to a bank account. But financial inclusion more largely defined, of course, is people participating in the stock market. Because financial markets derive strength and resilience from depth. And depth comes when more and more people participate. So I would say that young people, youth, participating in the stock market is a good thing. But participate in the stock market wisely, cautiously. And as a rule, do not play with your parents' money, nor with your friends' money, nor with borrowed money. But if you're earning yourself, and if you want to put part of that in the stock market and want to invest prudently, cautiously, wisely, sometimes you lose money, sometimes you gain money, but I think it's a good idea.
Okay, sir. Kartika asks, you mentioned about poor infrastructure and skill shortage in India, and we have observed a lot of brain drain in India where engineers settle in foreign countries. So should we work on encouraging the engineers to work in India for overcoming these issues? If so, how?
You know, this brain drain has been a question that's been around ever since I joined Serbia. I was like you people. You know, for the last 50 years, it's been with us. And I believe it was much more of a problem in the 1970s and 80s than it is now, for several reasons. As much as some of our talented people go away, there is enough talent within the country. I don't believe that India is so starved of talent that if a few thousand people, indeed a few million people go away, there is not enough people left in the country. There is enough talent. So if some people find it to their comparative advantage to go outside the country, I would think that's a good thing for the country, good for them, good even for us. I wouldn't worry about brain drain because there is enough brain within the country, even after some brain has drained away. The second reason is that in this age of globalization, contribution to the economy is not location specific. You can be in any way, you can be in Indonesia, in Japan, in Poland, in Iceland, in Russia, in America, wherever you are, you can contribute to the domestic economy. So to believe that you must reside in the country in order to be able to contribute to the country is, I think, misplaced. Wherever you get the best opportunities, you go there, but remember that your country, you owe something to the country and try to give it back.
Yes, sir, very well said. I completely agree with this. Another student, Om, asks, so what's your view on the current government policies regarding cryptocurrencies, given India's past about crypto?
Well, I wish I knew what the government's policy on cryptocurrencies is, because government itself has said that they've yet to come out with a policy on cryptocurrencies. As of now, they're not banned. As of now, that investment in cryptocurrencies is taxed as per the latest budget. But my own view on cryptocurrencies is that it is difficult to ban them because banning mechanisms are porous. If you ban them, they will go underground. As long as people can believe that they can make money out of it, they will continue to indulge in them. And our ability to detect and catch them is low. So instead of driving it underground, I think it'll be better for the government to keep it overground, regulate it, tax it, so that people invest cautiously, and those people who want to burn their hands, of course they burn their hands, but there is sufficient regulation and sufficient consumer awareness about cryptocurrencies. The second part of my answer is, of course, that there is an official cryptocurrency coming, which is the digital rupee, central bank digital currency. The RBI has said, the finance minister has said that there is going to be a CBDC over the next 1 year. There is a rationale for central bank digital currency, but I'm not sure to what extent it will change our user experience. Most of us already use digital mechanisms for transaction. We don't use cryptocurrencies. Even if we're transacting with our financial system, with our banks, we are using digital technologies for making online transactions, for sending money to each other, for debit cards, credit cards, UPI payments, Amazon Pay, Google Pay, Paytm, etc. So even when the CBDC comes, even when an e-rupee comes, I believe our experience is not going to be far different. There might be some overall benefit to the economy, but that is not very clear as yet.
Okay, sir. I agree with that. I think regulation is always the answer. Banning is never the answer. And about CBDCs, I think that the government will have more control over the monetary system. They can freeze funds and all of that easier. Another question from my end and another student, like we have similar questions. Should the Reserve Bank buy government bonds for the quantitative easing that happened throughout the pandemic? As you spoke about borrowing and repayment by the younger and the older generation, the inflation, like the easiest way to repay loans is by printing more money, inflation. And Aditya also asks that in the government of India is liquidating its stake in PSUs, PSEs. So is that the correct way to raise money?
Okay, two questions. Both of them are very deep and require very, very elaborate answers. Let me try and be as clear and as brief as possible. On the first question about RBI monetizing the deficit, there are two parts to that. No, government borrowing is quite different from RBI financing it. Under the current system, the government, both at the center and in the states, they borrow from the open market. In other words, they borrow from banks. Their rate of interest that the central government and the state governments command is determined by the market. The RBI does not determine that. What the RBI does is a secondary operation. In order to manage the liquidity in the system, not for the purpose of government borrowing, but for the purpose of monetary policy, for the purpose of ensuring that there is price stability, for the purpose of ensuring that there is financial stability, the RBI has to do liquidity management. For that purpose, it buys bonds from the banks. Sometimes it sells bonds to the banks. That is secondary monetization. It is not directly monetizing the government's deficit, but it is doing so in the secondary operation because it is taking on government's debt from the books of the bank to the books of the RBI. That is okay. That is permitted. That is acceptable because that is a market mechanism. What we were talking about 2 years ago when we were hit with the intensity of the pandemic was the RBI directly financing the government. I believe that should be done under very exceptional circumstances when the bond yields go very high, the government is unable to borrow at reasonable rates of interest, and if the government continues to borrow in the private markets, in the markets, there'll be financial instability. In those extreme situations, government should borrow from the RBI, RBI should lend directly to the government. We did not reach such a situation 2 years ago. We're certainly far from that today. So there might in the future be a situation where the RBI might have to finance directly, but that's not the case today. On the second question about PSUs, the government is disinvesting. Yes, I believe it should disinvest because investment in PSUs had taken place in the 50s, the 60s, in the 70s, when our economic philosophy was different, when our economic situation was different, our job situation was different, the private sector was small. Today, our private sector is large. The government does not have to be producing in the public sector. So it is efficient for the government to disinvest from public sector, production enterprises, some service enterprises, and invest that money in infrastructure because that is the crying need of the economy. Infrastructure needs public investment. So all the money that the government invested earlier in production units, in PSUs, must be taken, disinvested, and spent on infrastructure. That, I believe, is a positive thing to do.
So thanks for the very elaborate answer. That was quite insightful. So how much time do you have for more questions?
Whatever, as long as your interest stays. Maybe another, go ahead. It's okay.
Yeah. So continuing on that, Piyush asks, with the shifting world order and India still maintaining a non-aligned stance, do you believe we are poised to exploit the advantage of this changing geopolitical dynamics? You might have heard about the changing world order with regards to the currencies.
Piyush asked a question outside the syllabus because geopolitical situation is not my comparative advantage. You must ask international relations experts. But I do believe that it's going to be a conflicted world. Contrary to the world we saw after the end of the Cold War, the world we saw in the 80s and 90s. Today's, from about 2015 onwards, because of a lot of authoritarian leaders coming on the scene, the rise of China, the envy and the angst that produced Trump policies, the Russian invasion of China, Ukraine, dependence of some countries like India on oil imports, on defense imports. So the geopolitical situation is going to be more conflicted going forward. My worry, though, is that geopolitical conflict will cast its shadow on global economy and on globalization. Over the last 25 years, we made sure that even as there were geopolitical tensions, they did not cast a shadow on global economy. But we cannot be so sure about that. With sanctions on Russia today, with sanctions on several other countries in the past, China rising and trying to set up parallel systems of reserve currencies, payment systems, etc. So if the geopolitical situation continues to impact geoeconomics and globalization, it's going to be a much poorer world.
Okay, sir. Nand Kishore asks, so what were your challenges in front of you during your working period in RBI? So did your education help you, and do you still get nervous while taking a senior position because you are responsible for so much that happens in the country?
Several questions there from Nand Kishore. First, education certainly helped. Not just education in college. You heard of this cliche, your teachers, your parents, everybody tells you that education is a lifelong experience. You learn every day, you learn in every job. So you accumulate experience, you learn and unlearn. Education certainly helped. And there were certain times, all the time actually, not just in RBI, in every job that I did, there were concerns, challenges, anxieties, self-doubt about whether I can measure up to those challenges, whether I can deliver. But as much as self-doubt is natural, Some amount of confidence is also necessary. Too much of self-doubt is bad, too much of confidence is bad. So you must have a right combination of self-doubt and confidence in order to succeed in whatever you're doing. Do I get nervous? All the time. I was nervous before the session started about whether I'll be able to deliver the lecture. I was nervous about the questions that I'm going to get. So I'm nervous all the time. And I believe being nervous is oftentimes positive. You shouldn't be too nervous. But a certain amount of anxiety is a good thing.
Okay, sir. I wanted to ask this. So ever since we went off the gold standard, okay, so money is not backed by gold anymore. It's just the trust. And the US dollar is kind of backed by oil because it's the petrodollar. But then what about the other currencies? Are they just kind of a Ponzi scheme, or like would they vanish away someday? How do we trust them? What do you think about that?
Well, again, I have no definitive answer because that's in the realm of speculation. There is no gold standard today. No currency is backed by gold. That's gone. Currencies are called fiat currencies because central banks like the Reserve Bank of India can produce money out of thin air. So if the Reserve Bank of India decides to increase money supply by 100,000 crore tomorrow, they can do it. Not that they will do it, but they can do it. Countries do it all the time. But central banks have to be very responsible about that because if they print too much currency without production, what really happens is inflation. So your money supply has to keep pace with your production, what your economy demands. Otherwise, you will have inflation, you will have high inflation, you will have hyperinflation. As we saw in some countries like Zimbabwe, 100% inflation. The famous example they give of inflation, runaway inflation, is when you go to a restaurant to eat, you pay your bill before you order because the prices will go up by the time you finish eating. So that's hyperinflation. Central banks have to be responsible for how much currency they print, and that's indeed one of the main reasons. The responsibility of deciding how much currency to print is given to an independent central bank rather than the government. Because governments, all said and done, are susceptible to public demand, public influence. They cannot be very independent. Central banks, it is expected, can be more independent and more apolitical.
So we'll go with a last couple of questions. Rishikesh asks, what do you think would be good for the economy, for the Indian economy? As you have spoken earlier, there's a rift between the rich and the poor. So would capitalism be the best way forward, the way it is going right now? But wouldn't that create more difference?
I can't answer that question, because getting into isms, communism, capitalism, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, socialism is a very difficult thing because we don't have standard understanding of this. So instead of talking about capitalism, I will talk about what attributes or what a developing society must have, which is what I talked about in my last slide, Francis Fukuyama. Not that Fukuyama's 3 attributes cannot be questioned. They can be. You can add to that list, delete from that list. But a developing society, a country that wants to grow, a society that wants to prosper, has to have rule of law, has to have a strong state, has to have democratic accountability, has to have free markets, has to have India. One of our problems is chalta hai attitude. Everything goes, it's okay. So we must give up that. Lots of things we need to cut corners. Look at our traffic on our streets. Every day we see that we don't give way to an ambulance. So a lot of these things we need to do in order to become a developed society, a more humane society, a more inclusive society. We need to get a lot of things right.
Thank you, sir. Om asks, sir, as we often get to hear that RBI is often under pressure from the government, which sometimes leads to a rift between the two. Did you also face any such pressures, or you had full autonomy?
Of course I did. And the simple but offensive answer to that question is read my book. but I wouldn't say that. Om asked a very good question. I owe you a reasonable answer. Yes, there's pressure from the government. There was pressure on me, certainly. I can vouch for that. I don't know about other governors. They've spoken about their pressure. You got to see from their speeches and from their talks about what pressure they faced. And pressure between the government and central bank is not unique to India. It happens in every country. Trump put pressure on the Federal Reserve. Several Federal Reserve chairmen in America talked about pressure from their presidents. Several US presidents talked about how their Federal Reserves are not listening to them. There is pressure in the UK, there's pressure in Japan. In China, certainly, the central bank is a department of the Ministry of Finance. So there is pressure on every central bank, and that pressure is natural because of the division of responsibilities and the autonomy given to the central bank under most circumstances. I only want to answer this question with what Gerhard Schroeder, the former German chancellor, said. Before the ECB, the European Central Bank, Germany used to have a Bundesbank. It still is there. So Gerhard Schroeder, the former German chancellor, said, I had lots of differences with the Bundesbank, but I'm grateful that Bundesbank exists. So that's what politicians think about central banks.
Okay, sir. And last, Gargi asks that, so with regards to CBDCs, there are claims that with it, the government would be able to track every transaction, and that would stand in violation of the right to privacy. What are your thoughts on this?
That's a very good question, Gargi. I think right to privacy, the Supreme Court has said, is a fundamental right. And CBDC will certainly be able, at least from a technology perspective, it'll be able to track every transaction. So to what extent can the government and the RBI inspire the confidence of the public that they will not snoop unless it is permitted by law? And to what extent the public will trust our questions in the realm of speculation? And there is the Supreme Court, which said that right to privacy is a fundamental right. So how do we manage this tension between a CBDC and the right to privacy is something that we need to address as a country, and particularly the government and the RBI and the authorities need to address going forward.
Well, that's about it, sir, today. As this amazing session draws to an end, I would like to thank Dr. Subbarao, sir, for sparing some time from his busy schedule for us and guiding our budding future businessmen. I'm sure everyone would agree it was super insightful. I would also like to thank ESL VJTI for organizing this event as part of SNC. I hope you guys had a great evening. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Honored to have you here today. We are very honored to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.